All right, so jumping right into it with a question for you, a question that you've probably thought about a lot. What exactly is a logical truth? I mean, are we talking about something like fundamental to how we think? Or is it something more out there in the world? Maybe even just something we all kind of agree on.
Yeah, that's a big one, isn't it? The kind of question that philosophers love to dig into. And, well, knowing you, you've probably spent some time thinking about already. Lucky for us, we've got a fantastic resource to really dive deep with today. It's the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on, you guessed it, logical truth.
Absolutely. And this is, well, this is not some light reading. It's a super in-depth, very scholarly examination of a concept that honestly might seem simple at first glance. So what we're going to do today is really try to unpack the core of this SEP entry, right? Map out the big arguments, all those different philosophical angles. Basically, we're taking you on a guided tour through centuries of thought on this. We're talking Aristotle all the way up to some of the heavy hitters in contemporary logic, all wrestling with this idea of what is logical truth?
And yeah, like you said, this source it's just so thorough. I mean, it's a proper academic overview. The research is impeccable, and it looks at both sides of the coin, how we understand logical truth kind of intuitively, and then those really precise, mathematical ways people have tried to define it. So get ready. It's going to be a ride through the intuitive, but also the very formal sides of logical truth.
All right, so let's start maybe with a few examples. Things that probably strike you right off the bat as just logically true, no two ways about it. The entry uses a few to kind of get us going. Like, if death is bad, only if life is good, and death is bad, well, then life is good. I mean, that just feels like it has to be true, right?
Yeah, you can't really argue with that one, can you?
And then there's another, if no desire is voluntary and some beliefs are desires, then some beliefs are not voluntary. Again, feels pretty solid.
Rock solid, yeah.
And one more, just for good measure. If Drasha is a cat and all cats are mysterious, then Drasha is mysterious. No surprises there.
Nope, Josh has got to be mysterious.
hmm Right. So these examples, they really tap into that gut feeling we have about logical truths. It's like these things just, they can't not be true. But here's the thing, and the entry makes this point right away. Even though we have this strong intuition about specific cases, philosophers don't really agree on what exactly makes them logical truths. Like, what are the common threads?
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? We all kind of feel it, but putting your finger on why, that's the tricky part.
It really is. The entry highlights two main ideas about logical truth, but it also says there's no real consensus on either of them. So maybe we start with the first one, modality.
Yeah, modality. This is a biggie in a lot of discussions about logical truth.
Mhm.
The idea is that logical truths, well, they must be true, or you could say they couldn't be false. So it's about necessity or impossibility, something about them that just can't be any other way.
Um,
But the entry makes it clear that, well, most philosophers agree on that basic idea.
but that's about it.
Pretty much, yeah. Beyond that, they just don't agree on what that must really means or what couldn't actually implies. I mean, how do you even define what it means for something to have to be true in a logical sense?
Right, right. It's a really slippery concept when you try to pin it down. And then there's the second big idea, formality. This is the idea that logical truths, well, they're true because of their form, not because of the specific things they're talking about. So the content doesn't really matter. It's the structure, the logical form that makes it a truth. And that's where these schematic examples come in, these three
Yeah.
things.
So let's take that first example again, the one about life and death. We can represent its logical form like this.
Mhm.
If A is P, only if B is Q, and A is P, then B is Q. Now, the important thing here, especially for a philosopher like you, is that no matter what you plug in for those letters, for A, B, P, Q, as long as the sentence makes grammatical sense, it'll also be a logical truth.
So it's like we're abstracting away from the specific content, like life, death, good, bad, and we're left with this pure logical skeleton, and that's what makes it true.
Exactly. And we could do the same thing with those other examples using these placeholder letters. And there's a general agreement that certain words or phrases, these logical expressions, things like if and some, all, they're key to this whole formality thing. It's like they work across all sorts of topics.
Right, right. But, and you know this, the devil's in the details. Because Even though, broadly speaking, we get these logical expressions, there's just no real agreement on how to define them generally, like what actually counts as one of these special expressions.
Exactly. So even this seemingly simple idea of formality, it's actually got a whole bunch of complicated issues lurking underneath, just waiting for a curious philosopher to pick them apart.
It's like opening a can of worms, but like a very interesting can of worms.
Uh-huh, for sure.
So how about we trace how all these different thinkers have wrestled with this must be true aspect of logical truth? Like historically, how have they tackled this idea?
Yeah, let's do it. The entry gives us a fantastic historical overview of all these different interpretations.
Perfect. So, way, way back, we've got Aristotle. The entry interprets him, well, it interprets his idea of a syllogism's conclusion, necessarily following from its premises. It interprets that as an example of a true generalization, one that holds over all these different formal structures.
Right.
And there's even a quote from the prior analytics about how the conclusion comes about of necessity because they are so, the premises.
Yeah, the interpretation here is crucial. So think about that example we had, the one about beliefs and desires, example 2. The Aristotelian perspective, at least how the entry presents it, is that the necessity we see there is not some like deep metaphysical thing, but rather that specific argument is just one instance of a universally true pattern. So it's like for any P, Q, and R, if no Q is R, and some P are Q, then some P are not R.
Okay, so the specific example about desires and beliefs, that's just one case of this bigger universal truth that holds for anything we plug in for those letters.
Right. So for a philosopher like you, the key takeaway from Aristotle here is that necessity in logic, it's not about some mystical force. It's about the universal, the truly universal form of the argument.
So it's a much more grounded kind of necessity.
Yeah, exactly. Less otherworldly.
Okay, so that's Aristotle. And then we move on to Diodorus. He had a very different take on this whole must be true thing, didn't he?
Totally different. Diodorus, famously, he said necessity is just truth at all times. So a logical truth for him is something that, well, it's always been true and it'll always be true.
So if it was true yesterday and it's true today and it'll be true tomorrow, that's a logical truth.
That's the gist of it. And the entry uses a good example to highlight the difference. People watch TV.
Right, right.
So that statement about beliefs and desires that one might hold true across all of time, but people watch TV, well, definitely wasn't true back in Doris's time.
Makes sense. It's kind of intuitive in a way, right? That a logical truth should be timeless. But it also feels like maybe it misses something about what makes logical truth, well, logical.
Yeah, like it ties necessity too closely to like the actual world and how things change over time.
Exactly. And then we get to Leibniz, who the entry says really introduced this big idea of logical truths being true, not just in our world, but in all possible universes or all these different counterfactual situations.
Right. This is a huge shift. It's not just about what is true in our universe, but what would be true in any imaginable scenario.
Wow. So it's not just about what actually happens, but about what could happen or what would happen if things were different. That's a big leap.
It is a huge leap. And, it's really shaped a lot of contemporary philosophy. But even with Leibniz and those who followed him, there was often this kind of reductivist tendency. Like they'd try to understand these possible universes as being made up of, well, things that actually exist, maybe as like abstract descriptions or even thoughts in the mind of God. So all that contemporary debate about the metaphysics of modality, like Lewis and all that, that's still grappling with these ideas.
So it's like they wanted to ground this idea of possible universes in something more concrete, something we could at least imagine existing.
Exactly. They weren't ready to fully embrace the like abstract nature of these possibilities.
It's so interesting how even after Leibniz, a lot of logicians were still a bit hesitant about this idea of truth in all possible worlds. The entry mentions Bolzano, Frege, even Tarski. They all seem to lean more towards the idea of necessity being about these universal generalizations, almost like an echo of Aristotle.
Yeah, you see that thread running through a lot of their work. Bolzano, for instance, he defined necessary propositions as those whose negation is incompatible with, those purely general truths.
Okay, so if you can't deny something without contradicting a general truth, that makes it necessary.
Right. And then Frege saw necessarily as like indicating that there are these universal judgments out there that the proposition can be derived from. So for you, think of it like there's this bigger truth and the necessary proposition just follows logically from it.
Right, so the necessity is in that connection, that logical connection to the universal judgment.
Exactly. And Tarski, well, the entry points out that he seems very close to well, the Aristotelian view in a way. He sees the necessity of a conclusion, following from its premises, as just a case of a formal generalization.
Okay, so it's like that pattern we were talking about with the letters. The form itself is what makes it necessary.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's Quine, who, well, he just flat out rejected any kind of modality that couldn't be explained by universal generalizations about the actual world.
Ah, Quine. Always a skeptic. He really distrusted anything that smacked of, going beyond what we can observe.
He did. And the entry notes that this distrust of modality often went along with, well, a preference for understanding logical truth through the lens of validity, which we'll talk about later.
Uh-huh.
But it's really fascinating, to see this whole spectrum of views on the nature of logical necessity.
It is. It's like everyone agrees it's important, this idea of must be true, but then they all go off in different directions trying to explain what it actually means.
Mhm.
And the story doesn't end there, does it? We've got some newer perspectives to consider as well. What about logical pluralism?
Right. Logical pluralism. This is a really interesting one, championed by Beale and Restall. They say, well, logical truth isn't tied to just one set of cases or interpretations, the one true set. Instead, they say there can be multiple equally valid sets, and which one is right for you, well, that depends on the context and what you're interested in. So what counts as logically true might actually change.
Whoa, hold on. So there isn't just one set of logical truths, but many.
That's the idea. It really challenges that traditional view of logic. The one that says there's only one right answer. And then there's Rumfit, he came along a bit later, and he's got this idea of logical necessity as a kind of usability.
Usability. I'm not sure I follow.
There he's saying that a logical truth, it's necessary because it's usable in all sorts of different subject-specific ways of reasoning, like as long as those ways of reasoning follow certain, basic structural rules. So it's about being universally applicable in how we think, no matter what we're thinking about. And it's important for you to know he actually thinks classical logic still captures the core set of logical truths in, our standard ways of talking.
So he's not saying anything goes, just that there might be different ways to get to the same truth.
Exactly.
All right, so we've got this must in logical truth being interpreted in all these different ways, from just, simple generality to truth across all possible worlds, even to truth depending on the context. It really highlights how tricky this whole concept is, even though it seems so basic.
For sure. And this modality thing, it's just one part of the puzzle. The entry then goes on to another crucial aspect, the epistemic dimension. This is where a priority and analyticity come in.
Ah, yes. A priority and analyticity. The question of how we know logical truths, right? The idea that some things, like logical truths, are knowable a priori without us having to go out and test them in the world. Like we can just know them through reason alone. This seems to be another point where philosophers mostly agree.
Yeah. It goes way back, like all the way to Plato.
Right. And the entry traces this back to this intuition we have, that we can just know certain logical truths without needing empirical evidence. It even credits Leibniz with popularizing the term a priori in this context. And the classic examples, they always include math, definitions, and of course those logical truths we started with.
Exactly.
But, it's never that simple, is it? Even if we agree on what is a priori, that doesn't mean we agree on how a priori knowledge is even possible. We've got the classic rationalist view on one side.
Right. The rationalists like Leibniz and more recently Ponjour, they argue that our minds, they have this special ability to grasp truths just by examining the relationships between our ideas, these pure abstract concepts. It's like we have this inner faculty that can just see these necessary connections.
And then on the other side, we've got the empiricist view.
Yeah, the empiricists are much more skeptical of this whole innate capacity thing historically and still today. They see it as kind of mysterious and unnecessary. So they try to explain how we seem to have a priori knowledge in other ways.
And that leads us to conventionalism, right? The idea that what we think of as a priori knowledge, maybe it's actually coming from these conventions, these agreements we've made, like tacitly agreeing to accept certain sentences, to follow certain rules. The entry mentions Hobbes, and then later Wittgenstein and Carnap.
Yeah, though it's important for you to note that Wittgenstein and Carnap, at least how some people interpret them, they went really far with this. They said logical truths don't even express actual propositions. They're just like empty sentences that are useful tools. But more recent conventionalists, folks like Boghossian, they tend to reject that. They say our agreements actually do give us real a priori knowledge about things.
So for them, it's not just empty rules, it's real knowledge.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got these two big camps, the rationalists and the conventionalists. And they both, in their own ways, try to ground a priority in our ability to analyze the meanings of words, whether those meanings are like objective ideas or shared conventions. And that's where analyticity comes in, right? This idea that something's true because of the meanings of the words it uses.
Exactly. Analyticity is often seen as the key to unlocking this whole a priori thing. Because if a statement is analytic, then just understanding what it means, that should be enough to know it's true. You don't need to go out and test it.
And that's where Kant enters the picture, and things get a bit messy according to the entry. The standard interpretation is that Kant thought all logical truths were analytic. But there's been this long debate about whether that actually fits with how he defined analyticity.
Yeah, that's right. Kant gave a couple of definitions of analytic truths. One, that the predicate concept is contained in the subject concept. And two, that denying an analytic truth leads to a contradiction.
Okay, so like all bachelors are unmarried. The concept of unmarried is already part of what it means to be a bachelor. And if you say, no, some bachelors are married, well, you're contradicting yourself.
Right, exactly. And a lot of people, commentators like Mill, Husserl, the Niels, they've said that those definitions, they fit really well with tautologies, but they don't really work for everything Kant himself considered logically true, like syllogisms. So for a philosopher like you, it raises this really interesting question about what Kant's framework can and can't explain.
Yeah, like where are the boundaries of his system? And some people have even suggested, though the entry says it's not the most common view, that maybe Kant thought some logical truths were synthetic a priori. So true a priori, but not because of their meaning.
Right. On that interpretation, the a priority of those logical truths would come from the structure of our minds, those fundamental forms of judgment that shape how we understand the world.
So it's not about the meanings of the words themselves, but about how our minds are built.
Exactly. But, the standard reading still says that Kant thought all logical truths were analytic. And scholars like Allison and Hanna, they've offered interpretations that try to make this work with his definitions. Hanna, for example, suggests that Kant's forms of judgment, they can actually be seen as these, like, analyzable logical concepts.
Okay, so even within Kant scholarship, there's this back and forth about how to interpret his views on analyticity and logical truth.
Yeah, it's a complex issue. And then we have the early Wittgenstein, who had his own unique perspective on all this. He, kind of like Kant, thought that logical expressions, they don't have meaning in the same way that regular words do.
So what do they have then?
Well, in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein argued that logical truths, they don't actually say anything about the world. Instead, they show us the logical structure of the world, which he thought existed independently of us. So he wasn't a conventionalist, but he still called logical truths analytic, saying we can recognize them just by looking at the symbols themselves. But as the entry points out, this gets tricky when you try to apply it to quantificational logic.
Quantificational logic. That's the logic that deals with all and some, right?
Exactly. And Wittgenstein's picture, it just doesn't seem to fit as neatly there. So for you as a philosopher, this highlights the difficulty of grounding logic purely in symbols, without any reference to meaning or interpretation.
Yeah, it's like if the symbols don't have any connection to meaning, how can they tell us anything about the world, even its logical structure?
That's the problem. And it seems like Wittgenstein didn't really offer a clear explanation for how a priority fits into all this.
Right, like why should the logical properties of the world, even if they exist, be reflected in our notation?
Exactly. And then on top of all that, we have the radical empiricists and naturalists who say the whole idea of a priori knowledge is just wrong.
No a priori knowledge at all.
Nope. They argue that what we think of as a priori is actually just a kind of illusion.
So how do they explain things like logical truths or math, which seems so obviously a priori?
Well, Mill and Bolzano, they were early proponents of this view. And they suggested that logical truths are just very early and familiar generalizations from experience. So it's like we've encountered these patterns so many times from such a young age that we just come to see them as inherently true, even though they're really just based on lots and lots of observations.
So it's not that we have some special access to truth through reason. It's just that we've been conditioned by our experience to see certain things as undeniable.
Exactly. And this view, it really challenges a lot of traditional thinking in epistemology, how we know things.
It does. And of course, Quine comes back into the picture here with his famous critiques of conventionalism. The entry talks about how he pointed out the infinite nature of logical truths and questioned that hard line between, like, conventional truths and other kinds of truths.
Mm.
He even argued that all our accepted sentences, even the logical ones, they're more like hypotheses that we can revise based on what we experience.
Yeah, Quine was a major force in shaking up those traditional ideas of a priority and analyticity. And the entry also mentions some more recent folks who've argued against a priori knowledge, philosophers like Matti, Azuni, and Scher. They offer these more like naturalistic accounts of how we come to have logical beliefs without relying on any a priori justification.
So it seems like this whole debate about a priori and analyticity, it circles right back to the core question of what logical truth is. Like, how does it connect to our minds, to our experience of the world?
Exactly. It's all intertwined. And the entry then brings up this really important skeptical point. It's about inferential a priori knowledge of logical truths.
Inferential. So, like, knowing a logical truth because we inferred it from something else.
Right. The issue is that if we try to justify our knowledge of logical rules by, well, using those same rules in our justification, we run into a problem. It's a problem of circularity or infinite regress.
Right. It's like we need the rules to justify the rules, and that doesn't really work.
Exactly. The entry gives the example of Carol's dialogue with the tortoise about modus ponens, which I'm sure you've come across.
Ah, yes, the classic modus ponens problem.
So the question is, how can we justify our use of modus ponens, if P, then Q, P, therefore Q, without assuming that it's already valid? It's like any justification we give is going to have to rely on some logical principle, which then needs its own justification, and so on.
It's a real head-scratcher.
It is. And the entry mentions Dummett and Boghossian as key figures in contemporary philosophy who've really grappled with this challenge to our epistemic access to logical truth.
So we've looked at the modal side of logical truth, the must aspect, and we've dug into the epistemic side, the how we know aspect. But what about formality? This idea that logical truths aren't just necessary and knowable a priori, but that they're also, well, formal in some sense.
Right. The entry stresses that necessity and a priori, even if we accept them, they're still not enough to fully capture what makes something a logical truth. We need that additional element of it being true because of its logical structure, regardless of what it's specifically about.
Like that example we talked about earlier, if a widow runs, then a female runs, versus if a widow runs, then a log runs.
Exactly. Those two sentences, they might have a similar grammatical structure on the surface, but only the first one seems like a candidate for a logical truth because of the conceptual relationship between widow and female.
Right. It's not just about the grammar, it's about the underlying logic of the concepts involved. And this brings us back to the idea of logical form, those schematic letters standing in for content, and those special logical expressions providing the structure.
Yes, and the entry traces this focus on form all the way back to Aristotle and the Stoics.
So the idea that logical truth is about form goes way back.
Way back. Aristotle's figures in syllogistic logic, they were an early attempt to capture these abstract forms. And Alexander of Aphrodisias, he's credited with really making that distinction between matter and form in arguments. The matter being the specific content, the values we plug into those schematic letters, and the form being those logical expressions that connect it all together. And that distinction has been hugely influential in how we think about logic ever since.
So this idea of form versus content, it's not just a modern invention. It's been a core concern for philosophers of logic for centuries.
Absolutely. And that core idea that logical expressions are, they work across all different areas of discourse, that keeps popping up again and again.
Yeah.
From Aristotle to Frege to Tarski, it's like this central intuition about what makes something logical.
Right. It's like they're these universal tools of reasoning, these logical expressions.
Exactly. It's what the entry calls the minimal thesis about logical expressions. But, like we discussed before, just being widely applicable, that's not enough to define what's logical. I mean, most prepositions, they work across all sorts of topics, but we wouldn't say they're logical constants, would we?
Right. So there's got to be something more to it than just being widely applicable. So have there been any attempts to go beyond this minimal thesis and give us some more concrete criteria for what makes an expression logical?
Oh, absolutely. The entry goes through a few of them. One idea is semantic insubstantiality.
Insubstantiality, what does that even mean?
It's basically this idea, going back to Aristotle, that logic itself isn't about any specific subject matter. It's not like, biology or physics. It's about these very general principles of reasoning that apply everywhere. And the medievals, they had this idea of syncatogrammatic expressions, which were words that didn't have their own independent meaning, but they functioned to, like, structure the meanings of other words.
So they're like the glue that holds the sentence together, logically speaking.
Exactly. Buridan, for example, he had this idea that these syncatogrammatic expressions formed the form of a sentence, while the categorematic ones, the ones of their own meaning, formed the matter.
Okay, so it's like that form and matter distinction again, but applied to the words themselves.
Precisely. And for you, it's a great example of how philosophers have tried to capture this notion of logic being, in a sense, content-free. But the entry points out that there are some serious doubts about whether this syncatogrammaticity idea can really define what a logical expression is.
So what are the doubts?
Well, things like prepositions and adverbs. They seem to fit the bill of not having their own meaning, but they still structure how other words work together. But we don't usually call those logical, do we?
Right.
And then you've got predicates like is identical, which are definitely treated as logical, but they seem to have a pretty clear and independent meaning. So this whole syncatogrammaticity thing, it's a good starting point, but it's not a perfect solution.
So it's not quite specific enough to really capture what makes something logical. What other approaches have there been?
Well, one that's really interesting, especially for a philosopher like you, is permutation invariance.
Permutation invariance. That sounds complicated.
It's not as bad as it sounds. The idea, and it goes back to Tarski and others, is that logical expressions are the ones whose extension, the things they refer to in the world, stays the same, even if you shuffle around the individuals within that world.
Okay, so like if I have a group of people and I say all of them are wearing hats and then I rearrange those people, the truth of that statement shouldn't change, right?
Exactly. That's because all is a logical expression. It doesn't care about the specific identities of those people, just about whether they're all wearing hats. But if I said all of them are philosophers, well, if I shuffle them around and swap out some philosophers for non-philosophers, the truth of that statement would change.
Right, because philosopher refers to a specific group of people, not just a general property.
Exactly. So philosopher wouldn't be permutation invariant. And that fits with our intuition that it's not a logical term. And then something like are identical. That always holds between the same individual, no matter how you rearrange things. So it comes out as logical. But, and the entry points out this is a tricky one, there are counterexamples, like male widow.
Oh, Plato.
Yeah. That would likely refer to, well, nobody in any situation.
Right.
So its extension would always be empty no matter how you permute things. So it would be permutation invariant, but we wouldn't call it a logical expression.
So permutation invariance, it's a good way to weed out some non-logical expressions, but it's not foolproof.
Right. It's not a perfect criterion.
Okay, what other attempts have there been?
Another popular approach is to focus on pure inferentiality.
Pure inferentiality. Lay that one on me.
The idea is that the meaning of logical expressions, it comes from these purely inferential rules. Rules that govern how we connect different verbal items, not how we connect words to the actual world. So for you, think of it like the essence of a logical term lies in its role in reasoning and argumentation, not in its connection to reality.
Okay, so like a rule that lets me infer it's raining from seeing rain outside.
Yeah.
That wouldn't be purely inferential.
Right. Because that rule is connecting a word, raining, to something in the world, the rain.
But a rule that lets me infer a conclusion from a set of premises, that would be purely inferential.
Exactly, because that rule is only about the relationships between the statements, not about their connection to the world.
I think I'm starting to get it, but I bet there are some wrinkles to this approach too, right?
Oh, there are always wrinkles. One issue is that these rules also need to avoid bringing in any extra sense or meaning that isn't purely logical. And even when you try to make those rules really precise, there are still problems, like inductive reasoning that seems connected to the meaning of all, but it's hard to capture that with purely deductive rules. And you can still come up with non-logical expressions that seem to be governed by these inferential rules, the same ones that apply to logical expressions.
So defining logical terms based solely on their inferential role, that's also not a slam dunk.
Nope, not at all.
It seems like pinning down the exact criteria for logical expression, it's been a real challenge for philosophers of logic.
For sure. The entry even mentions that some philosophers have suggested, just throwing it out there, that maybe the whole distinction between logical and non-logical maybe is just meaningless. And that logical truth is basically just analytic truth. But as you know, even that view has its problems.
It seems like wherever we turn, we run into these deep philosophical questions about the nature of logic itself. So we've wrestled with modality, a priority, formality, all these different facets of logical truth. But the entry also takes us into a different realm, the mathematical characterization of logical truth. And this sounds like where modern logic really comes into its own.
It does. One of the big achievements of modern logic, and it really started with Frege, has been the development of these formalized languages, artificial languages with their own symbols, precise grammar, and deductive rules. The goal here was